And it looks like we're back up. Welcome to Philosophy Roulette. Oh man, I think we're at 31. I should check this. I keep getting the numbers wrong. And yeah, where we grab a random paper of academic philosophy basically and analyze it immediately. Just see what we get. It's a reaction video in some sense. So, hope everyone's having a good day. A good start to their day. Today's Monday. Good start to the week. Let's see. We were looking at analysis papers because if you get any longer than analysis of thought, it just tends to get a little too extended. So here we go. Let's see. In animation, a network of feeling and perception. Well, let's see if we can do that one. Who knows what this is? Matteo Ravazio. Nope. Nothing here. Oh, shucks. If I can't do it. And if you don't have a website, Matteo, I can't even check to see if you put it up on your site. Okay. And personally, I'm a little insulted by academia.edu and ResearchGate, so I tend not to use those websites. I mean, if they have a paper there, I'll download them, but... Alright, so this is what it's going to be. Because this is available. Ways of Thinking About Ways of Being. By Bradley Rettler. So if you are in the live stream, you can type paper in the like exclamation point paper in the chat, and it will send this link that's here now will pop up, and or the link to the fill paper site will pop up, and you'll be able to follow along if you so choose. Alrighty. Save file. Okay, here we are. I have not read this before. I have no idea who Bradley Rettler is. I hope it's good. Ways of Thinking About Ways of Being introduction. In many ways, ways of thinking. Alright. In many ways, I don't resemble the computer on which I am typing this paper. It is shiny. Well, I don't know. Maybe you are shiny. You don't realize it. It is shiny, draws electricity from an outlet, is playing the Hamilton soundtrack. Yeah, I don't know if you guys can hear what I'm playing, but I do not play musical soundtracks while reviewing philosophy papers. Maybe I should. That might actually make me smarter. This is a good idea. I like you already, Bradley. It is composed of many circuits and was produced in a variety of factories. Well, depends how you define all these terms, but maybe it's the case. They weren't the same factories that you were made in, that the computer was made in. Of course, we are alike in many ways as well. We are both in my office. We are both located in space. We are both physical objects. We both have color. We both exist. And I know people that would argue with you on every single one of those claims. This latter claim, the claim that we both exist, comes from the thesis that everything exists, and I know people that would argue with you in that one, and exist in the same way. But there are some who think that not everything exists in the same way. Here we go. Okay. Pluralists about being think that some things exist in different ways or enjoy different ways of being. Of course, even pluralists may think that my computer and I exist in the same way. Pluralism is often motivated by considerations of things even more different than my computer and me. Some pluralists, for example Russell and Moore, think that concrete objects and abstract objects exist in different ways. I mean, sure, you could have dualism, like yeah, here we go. Others, for example Aquinas, think that God and created things exist in different ways. What it takes to be a pluralist is just to think that there is more than one way of being, and for each way of being, at least one thing exists in that way. It is, let's see, is that necessary? Yeah, I was like, I was like, this person must know that there are other thoughts, and apologies to Minong, yes. Yeah, most people I believe most people are not Minongian at the moment. There was there's an old joke about Hegel, or maybe it wasn't Hegel, just some philosophers, like, no one would actually, even they didn't believe what they said. And so they weren't, like, a Hegel wasn't Hegelian. Pluralism is at present the minority view. Monism, the view that there is just one way to be, reigns. And pluralism has recently come under fire. Merrickx has given 3 arguments against pluralism. First, he argues that pluralists who do not accept a way of being that everything has hereafter generic existence cannot state a pluralism that posits a specific number of ways of being. Okay. Second, he argues that pluralists who do accept generic existence thereby undermine the main motivation for pluralism, and that their view is especially vulnerable to classic objections to pluralism. Finally, he argues that since pluralists can't accept generic existence for the more aforementioned reasons, they can't make claims about everything. Biles thinks that the pluralists can respond to Merrick's arguments, but offer a dilemma to pluralists concerning whether pluralism is a fundamental fact. In Section 2, I distinguish several versions of pluralism. In Section 3, I show which versions of pluralism can respond to Merrick's arguments. In Section 4, I show how the version of pluralism that can respond to Merrick's arguments should respond to Biles' dilemma. The ways of thinking about ways of being. Yeah, so it might seem like there is one way to think about pluralism. It is the view that there is more than one way of being. According to the standard division, monists think that there is only one way to be, and pluralists think that there are many ways to be. But that division is too coarse-grained to capture what many pluralists believe. These pluralists help themselves to the notion of naturalness, developed in Lewis, 83. So it's worth saying a bit about naturalness before presenting the pluralist views. A predicate is more natural than another when the former carves nature at the joints better than the latter does. For example, the predicate has mass is more natural than the predicate has mass or is 2 meters tall. The predicate is a dog is more natural than the predicate is the tallest building in the first state to have a female governor. Some predicates are perfectly natural. Perfectly natural predicates are the ones that carve nature perfectly at the joints. Perhaps has -1 charge is perfectly natural. I mean, personally, yeah, let's see what more gets said about naturalness here. It's a little hand-wavy at the moment. The notion of naturalness might apply to predicates in virtue of those predicates referring to properties which are more or less perfectly natural or more or less perfectly fundamental. Fundamentality is akin to naturalness and will play a role in Section 4. But as Lewis points out, even nominalists can believe in a notion of naturalness. We might wonder whether, in addition to predicates, naturalness applies to other bits of language. Particularly relevant to this paper is the question of whether some quantifiers might be more or less natural than others, whether there is a quantifier that is perfectly natural. Alright. Nothing was said here about arguing for naturalness, is just appealing to the Lewis. And carved nature at the joints is a nice... It sounds great, but it's perfectly opaque, really. I mean, we don't know what the nature is that we are carving and how carving is done and what a natural joint would actually be. I mean, a lot of times this stuff just comes down to logic. Like, you're carving at the logic. You see, mass or 2 meters tall. And it's the first building state to have a female, so building and female governor. So, like, you break this stuff just by the logic. I'm not entirely, I'm unhappy with natural as a way of distinguishing, as a way of choosing things to be fundamental, or I'm just saying, I don't know if calling something natural actually gets you here according to this these this way of speaking and taking that as fundamental or natural, whatever you prefer. Why fundamental is natural, natural is fundamental. But anyway, this is just, it is standard talk, so it's not a objection to this paper in some sense. Just objection to natural talk and fundamental talk without just a general concern. One might think that there is only one way to be, or one might think that there is only one perfectly natural way to be, and there are many ways that are less natural. One might think that there are many ways to be, all equally natural. One might think something else. Granted the notion of naturalness, we can formulate at least 6 views regarding being and whether there are ways of being. Let's see, here's a footnote on what it is to carve nature at joints. Help I think about what predicates God would use how would I have, this is the problem. What predicates God would use if you had to give the best description of the world, presumably, and why would I have any idea how God views the world? This is just you're swapping out nature for God here. If you ask nature what would she use in the very best description of her world, it's how, and you could be swap out alien for that matter for this word, and then you're going to see my problem here, because how would an alien view the world? I have no idea. And you'd hope that some other being would we would have some overlapping sort of viewpoints, but there's no guarantee of that sort of thing, especially in philosophy. Alright, back to the 6 views regarding what being and whether there are ways of being. Ways of being 1. There is only one way to be, and everything that exists in that way. Way being 2. WB2. There is only one perfectly natural way to be, and everything that exists in that way. There are other ways of being, but they are less natural than the one way to be, such that everything exists in that way. Alright, so we got gradations here. There are many ways to be, and no one way is more natural than the other. 4. There are many ways to be, none of which is more natural than any other, and one way to be such that everything exists in that way, and the way to be such that everything exists in that way is less natural than every other way to be. So there are many ways to be, none of which is more natural than one way, and the way to be such that everything exists in that way is less natural than every other way to be. Okay, so it means that there's more than one way to be, and to be all of them is less natural. Okay. There are many ways of being. 5. There are many ways to be, and one way to be such that everything exists in that way, and none of those is more natural than any other. Ways of being. 6. There's no ways to be, or if there are, nothing exists in any of the ways to be that there are. Okay. Turns out many of these views have been adopted. Okay, so we've got a bunch of references here that not really worth reading through. I was wondering if we were going to get to a Heidegger, because Heidegger talked about ways of being. We've got more Heidegger, Meinong, Sider, Corman, Merrick's, bunch of people. This is a contested, there are many different ways of, many people have taken different views on all of these sorts of ways of being. Alright, so these are not trivial viewpoints, is the point. Ways of being 1 is monism, ways of being 3 is obviously a version of pluralism, but ways of being 4 also seems like a version of pluralism, as does ways of being 5. Ways of being 6 is nihilism, ways of being 2 is somewhere between monism and pluralism, and could be classified as either. I now turn to Merrick's argument against pluralism. I think the argument succeeded against WB3, but not against WB4. Okay. Merrick's 2019 first offers a dilemma against a particular version of pluralism. Pluralism that believes in exactly 2 ways of being. Let's call such a view pluralism 2. We could call that dualism too, for that matter. The dilemma is, Merrick's dilemma, does a pluralist 2 also accept that there is a generic way of being such that everything exists in that way? So, monism. If not, he argues the pluralist 2 can't state pluralism 2, nor can she make claims about everything. So the claim is a way of being then, too? So if you're gonna... Alright, let's finish the paragraph. If so, he argues that 1 undermines the classic motivation for pluralism, 2 makes pluralism especially vulnerable to a classical objection, and 3 is inconsistent with what the pluralists have said. Although we'll take the second horn, let us briefly examine the first horn. There's 3 here. So you can't have 2 horns. Maybe I'm missing something? Okay, so it's probably just the yes or no to this dilemma. The pluralist 2 wants to say that there are 2 ways of being. She will also presumably want to say that everything enjoys one of those 2 ways of being, such that each of those 2 ways of being has something that exists in that way. Otherwise, it is consistent with pluralism 2 that nothing exists, or that everything enjoys just one way of being, or that some things exist in some third way of being. The natural way of stating pluralism 2 in first order logic, with subscripts to denote different quantifiers corresponding to different ways of being, is there exists some E1 for all things. It's existential 1. There exists some one thing where y is x or y2 is x, and there exists one where and existential 1 x equals x and existential 2 x equals x. You know, you could have used something other than x's over here if you're gonna keep reusing the same variable, but okay. But so basically it just says there's 2 sorts of things, because either for all things it's one or it's the other, and if it is it, then it's identical to itself, and then it's identical to itself. So you've got this so it's either one or the other, pluralism 2. But there's a generic unrestricted quantifier in pluralism 2. Yeah. And the first horn of the dilemma doesn't allow for generic unrestricted quantifiers. This is unrestricted. The pluralist 2 accepts the first horn must restate pluralism 2, and perhaps something like, so again we're doing quantifiers in existence. This happens a lot. I mean, it's a difficult problem. Perhaps something like pluralism 2 star. And you see now the universal quantifier here has subscripts, and so basically the difference is you're multiplying quantifiers, so you're multiplying universal quantifiers. So you've got the same first conjunct here, but with both of one or the other quantifier, and then you've got the same other identity conditions at the bottom. Alright, but pluralism 2 doesn't rule out some third or fourth or fifth way of being that some things enjoy, and it doesn't rule out existing 1 and existing 2. So they could be both in this sort of setup, and there could be other stuff. This is like descriptive, not prescriptive, I guess you could call these sort of logical formulations. And the same goes for pluralism n for any n. Any statement of it won't rule out some n+1 way of being, or that nothing exists in multiple ways of being. Okay. Because it doesn't limit the world. It just says that they can be described. That they can be satisfied by these formulas can be satisfied, and meaning that the world can be described by pluralism 2. Doesn't mean is pluralism 2. It's just descriptively adequate. But note, as Marek does, that while this dilemma generalizes to pluralism n for any n, it doesn't generalize to all pluralism. A pluralist needn't be a pluralist n for some n. One could just be a pluralist. One could also think that there are at least 2 ways of being and not take a stand on how many. That position can be stated. Excuse me. Indeed, it is the very position stated in pluralism 2 star. One could think there are at least n ways of being for any n and state that position. What Marek's dilemma shows us is that pluralists can't state that there are exactly n ways to be for any n without a generic unrestricted quantifier. And it shows us that pluralists can't state that there are no more than n ways to be for any n without a generic unrestricted quantifier. So it's all hanging on the difference between subscript quantifiers and non-subscript quantifiers. So this universal quantifier here can't. They're saying this is generic because it ranges over all things. And so if you have a quantifier that ranges over all things, then all things have to be described in terms of that one domain, and so hence there can't be a description that is ranged over in a pluralist sense, because to talk about them would be to have one domain still in this generic spot. Sure. Okay. So the pluralist stand for any n, and the pluralist who wants to say that there are no more than n things for any will be generic. Will want a generic unrestricted quantifier. They will need to take the second horn of the dilemma. The first horn ruled out pluralism too, but the second horn of the dilemma accepts that there is a generic unrestricted way of being such that pluralism exists in that way, which is formally represented by the backwards E and upside down A. In this case, there exists n for all. So pluralism 2 is back on the table as a statement of pluralism 2. Shocking. And taking the second horn allows us to make a claim about everything. Let's go look real briefly at what pluralism 2 is again, because I'm just... Alright, let's call such a view exact way of being pluralism. Does plus... Let's call such... Alright. I succeed in W3. Alright, so we've got this pluralism too. And there are many ways to be, but no one way is more natural than the other. Okay. So this is basically the target of that argument was this 3 and 4, as author said. 3 but not against 4 because you need a generic. And that way they're going to claim that generic is somehow more natural. Whether generic is natural or unnatural is I guess just going to be assumed. It's more natural to be a generic. Alright. So we're down here. And taking the second one, and makes a claim about everything. Merrick gives 3 reasons that the pluralist shouldn't accept a generic unrestricted quantifier. One reason is that virtually all pluralists of the past have not accepted a generic unrestricted quantifier. I won't try to respond to this reason. Perhaps someone could do an exegetical history of philosophy to show that armed with the notion of naturalness, WB4 would have been acceptable to past pluralists. I will not try to do so. I will deal with the other 2 reasons and concede to Merrick's that past pluralists would not have liked WB4. Nevertheless, if it can help us resolve Merrick's and Bowles' dilemma, it might be the best version of pluralism. You know, saying that people in the past wouldn't like something but now they should, might be a very strong point in the favor of said WB4. Like, in the past we couldn't do this, now we can. It's much better, and we can show you how. And the reasons of the past are in the past. Like, those times are past. We now know better. Like, that's a good thing, perhaps, not a bad thing. So, I mean, the notion that just because appealing to history is not always the right strategy. Sometimes appealing to the failure of history, like, hey, we failed every other time, let's do something different, is also sometimes a good idea, and sometimes it's very stupid because the people of the past weren't stupid. But I mean, if you actually do get something right, it would be very noteworthy. The second reason that Merrick's American Bowles' dilemma, it might be the best version of pluralism. The second reason that Merrick says a pluralist shouldn't accept a generic unrestricted way of being is that accepting a generic unrestricted way of being undermines the motivation for pluralism. Yeah. That concrete and abstract things are so different as to not enjoy a single way of being, and that God and creation are so different as to not enjoy a single way of being, and the like. In response, I think WB4 pluralists can still state this reason, or at least say something that captures the intuition behind it. Although WB4 pluralism accepts that there is a way of being that concrete and abstract things both enjoy, it says that it is not a natural way of being, and not a very natural way of being. Again, we do not actually know what natural is, or very, for that matter, in this context. It is less natural in any case that the way of being that all and only concrete things enjoy. Again, concrete's a term of art here. It has meaning in many of these other reference papers. I can't remember what concrete means right now, but I've seen it before. Otherwise, it wouldn't get used here because it wouldn't make sense. It has been more precisely defined in the past, but not here, which is okay. Only things enjoy, and is less natural than the way of being that all and only abstract things enjoy. It is, as Chris McDaniel, who we've reviewed a long time ago now, a long time ago last week. But it was like, I think McDaniel was like the second person I reviewed. It is, as McDaniel puts it, akin to a mere disjunction of the metaphysically basic ways of being. So wait, what is it akin? It's less natural akin to the way of being of all and all countries. It's less natural than the way of being that all absolutely enjoys. Akin to a disjunction of the metaphysically basic ways of being. So okay, if you're going to if you're going to say that there is a generic, you're just combining all of the abstract ways of being together in a disjunction, which is, reasonable. So although the pluralist accepts generics unrestricted, a generic unrestricted way of being that accepts enjoy that everything enjoys, can't say that a concrete and abstract things are so different than that there is no way of being that they both enjoy. She can say that the concrete abstract things are so different that the ways of being that they both enjoy is quite unnatural. Okay, so this is going back to the naturalness and what I was saying about logic, that many times naturalness claims just are appealing to logic, and so if you've got these disjunctive objects or a disjunctive way of being that just covers all the different ways of being in one sort of this or this or this or this or this way, they don't like that because they appeal to the logic as being unnatural, basically. If you are using logic in a naturalness thing, you can't do that, and so that would be an unnatural sort of object to have disjunctiveness in it. The third reason Marx says a pluralist shouldn't accept a generic, unrestricted way of being is that it increases pluralism's vulnerability to an objection to pluralism. So this is a philosophy from the future, as the chat says. It's a future philosophy. This is a very recently published paper, so maybe the analysis has some super efficient review process. I don't know. The objection, relevant to object plural. Let's find out what the objection is. The objection is that the pluralist posits a difference in being where there is instead a difference in kind among entities that exist in the same way. Okay. Once one accepts a generic unrestricted way of being that everything enjoys, then since presumably one also accepts predicates like is abstract, is concrete, is divine, and is created, and so on, one can make the distinction that the pluralist wants to make without the extra quantificational apparatus, without positing ways of being. Okay, so you're just like doing it at the predicate level now. In response, I think the WB4 pluralist should agree that one can distinguish objects by using predicates instead of quantifiers. Woo! However, she can say that this is less natural. Again, what is with the naturalness? Less joint carving way of putting things. Okay, again, because you're doing a predicate, and so you got predicate logic. Again, when you are multiplying your logic, that happens to, for some reason, be less natural. I don't know why that is, but that's what people say. So, less joint... you can see where my objection is coming from. Or it's going to be. The generic quantifier is less natural than the others, and so any sentence that uses the generic unrestricted quantifier is less natural than a sentence that refers to one of the ways of being that not everything enjoys. The book of the world then contains quantifiers referring to many ways of being, not the generic unrestricted quantifier. Pluralist, what is it? What is a pluralist? More than one way to be. Like dualism or and many types of stuffs. So actually, if I'm gonna read that out, I shouldn't have bothered typing it, but hey, whatevers. Yeah, this is about plural. The title of this paper, if you join late, is ways of talking about, or ways of being, ways of thinking about ways of being, and yeah, if you just type, yeah, you can get the link to the paper here. So we're just discussing different ways of talking about it, and these WB4 is the fourth way that the author is discussing it. Alright, so the Book of the World then contains quantifiers referring to the many ways of being, not the generic unrestricted quantifier. So I conclude that Merrick's has shown that the pluralist who doesn't accept a generic unrestricted quantifier cannot state pluralism that posits a particular number of ways of being, nor can she state a pluralism that posits a maximum number of ways of being, though she can state a pluralism that posits a lowest number of ways of being. Yeah, that's fair. The pluralist who does accept a generic unrestricted quantifier can make claims about everything, and so she can state a pluralism that posits a particular number of ways of being, and she can state a pluralism that posits a maximum number of ways of being. Yeah, and the title's over here. I am losing my mind. Forgot I put the title up today. Sometimes I forget. So she can state a pluralism that maximum ways of being, and she can state a pluralism that posits maximum ways of being. Okay. A particular number of ways of being and a maximum. Alright. But in order to respond to Merrick's objections to pluralists that can accept a generic unrestricted quantifier, such as a pluralist, a WB4 pluralist ought to go in for a talk of naturalness and or fundamentality. For the sake of simplicity, I'll suppress the WB4 for the rest of the paper and assume we're talking about WB4 pluralism. And just for my own edification, WB4 pluralism, oh no, here is here. There are many ways to be, none of which is more fundamental than any other, and one way to be such that everything exists in that way, and the way to be such that everything's in that way is less natural than the other ways to be. So basically, there are many ways to be, and if you're going to quantify over all of them, that is somehow an artificial way of being, the way to talk about everything. Okay. Byles' dilemma. Byles issues an additional dilemma to pluralists. Is pluralism to a fundamental fact? And we're back to fact talk, because somehow everyone thinks facts are fundamental nowadays. The dilemma assumes two principles about fundamentality that come from Sider 2011. Purity. Fundamental facts only contain fundamental notions. And completeness. Every non-fundamental truth holds in virtue of some fundamental truth. To further explain completeness, Sider introduces the notion of metaphysical semantics. A metaphysical semantics gives truth conditions for non-fundamental facts that appeal only to fundamental facts. So for a sentence S in a language L that contains non-fundamental expressions, a metaphysical semantics for L contains something of the form S is true in L if and only if phi, where phi contains no non-fundamental expressions. Okay. In this way, sentences with non-fundamental terms can be true, but made true by fundamental things in virtue of having a metaphysical semantics that gives truth conditions that only refer to those fundamental things. Okay, so you've got a hierarchy here that everything has to come down to the metaphysically fundamental things, the fundamental facts. So, the metaphysical semantics, the statement of the form S is true in L if and only if phi, are not fundamental since they include sentences S above that have non-fundamental expressions. So their being fundamental would violate purity. But the truth condition phi above are fundamental. Yeah, this is academic stuff, so I do. So should pluralists say that pluralism too is a fundamental fact? If the pluralist says yes, then given purity, every expression in pluralism too has to be a fundamental expression. Okay, so this is sort of some sort of epistemic forcing. You're forcing, well, maybe not epistemic, metaphysical forcing. You're forcing all the things in virtue of being a fundamental fact, of pluralism too being a fundamental fact, then everything there also has to be a fundamental expression. There is a generic unrestricted universal quantifier in pluralism too, so given purity, the generic unrestricted universal quantifier is fundamental. We can then define the generic unrestricted existential quantifier in terms of the generic unrestricted universal quantifier, so it seems that pluralism must accept that the generic unrestricted existential quantifier is fundamental. Okay, so that would violate the second clause in WB4, which I'm sure we'll get to. But Biles thinks that saying yes and accepting the generic unrestricted existential quantifier is fundamental comes at a high price. But accepting that the generic unrestricted quantifier is fundamental doesn't entail believing that no other quantifier is fundamental or as fundamental. Okay, so you can multiply quantifiers. It is only open to one who accepts WB5. To accept this, the generic unrestricted existential quantifier is just as fundamental as many other ways of being. Perhaps Biles' argument gives us some reason to accept WB5. Biles does, however, argue against WB5 in Section 5, saying that it is less parsimonious and undermines the pluralist response to Merrick's argument, so perhaps it will not turn out to be better than WB3 or WB4. But consider the second horn saying no. Then by completeness, pluralism 2 must have a metaphysical semantics. Truth conditions for pluralism 2 must contain only fundamental expressions. The generic unrestricted existential quantifier and the generic unrestricted universal quantifier, we are supposing, are not fundamental expressions. So a metaphysical semantics for pluralism 2 cannot make use of them in giving truth conditions for pluralism 2. So the generic are not fundamental expressions. Why are not the quantifiers fundamental expressions? I guess we are supposing. I'm not entirely certain on that at the moment. Anyway, let's move on. I don't think it's critical. Well, I don't know. Maybe it is. Biles says that the pluralist cannot give a metaphysical semantics for pluralism 2. He rests this on the argument from Merrick, saying the pluralist must give the truth conditions for the claim that everything exists, either exists 1 or exists 2, using only fundamental notions that do not include the notion of generic existence. But wait, this is the very task Merrick's argued that the pluralist cannot do. The argument from Merrick that Biles is referring to is the argument that the pluralist who doesn't accept a generic unrestricted quantifier cannot state a pluralism that posits exactly n ways of being for any n. And given purity, truth conditions for pluralism 2 cannot contain a generic unrestricted quantifier. First, I respond that the pluralist can give truth conditions for the claim that there is more than one way of being. She can say that there are at least 2 ways of being such that one thing exists in each way, and that can be a fundamental fact. This may be enough for many pluralists. Second, I suggest the pluralist 2 can give truth conditions for the claim that everything either exists 1 or exists 2, using only fundamental notions that do not include the notion of generic existence. A metaphysical semantics has 4 components: the sentence S, the language L, the truth conditions phi, and the statement that S is true in L if and only if phi. The statement that S is true in L if and only phi is what I'm calling the metaphysical semantics for S. Yeah. In the present case, S is pluralism 2, L is in English, phi is pluralism 2 star, and the metaphysical semantics is that pluralism 2 star is true in English if and only if pluralism 2 star. S must contain non-fundamental terms, and pluralism 2 does. Phi must not contain fundamental terms, and pluralism 2 star does not. What about the metaphysical semantics? Clearly, it needn't contain only fundamental terms, since it contains S, which must contain non-fundamental terms. The task is to give a sentence for phi that's 1 true if pluralism 2 is true, and 2 doesn't use generic existence. That sentence is pluralism 2 star. It clearly meets condition 2. Does it meet condition 1? Is it true? Is the following true? We've got some rather extended logic here, which I'm not going to attempt to read. We're calling this thing MSP. Let me see if I can parse it quick. So there's one or the other thing. There's at least 2 things. There's 2 sorts of existentials here, and they actually exist if they. There's at least 2 things that exist. 2 different types of things that exist, and. Yeah, so this is just pluralism 2 extended, where we've got the minimal conditions built in from just a few paragraphs above. Okay. The pluralist 2 thinks that MSP is true. This is because she thinks that pluralism 2 star is the fundamental language. In the fundamental language is true when and only when pluralism 2 is true in English. In the fundamental language, existential 1 and existential 2 and universal 1 and universal 2 quantify over everything, and they are not just the same and they are not the same quantifier. And whether MSP is true is judged by the pluralist 2's own lights. So yeah, of course, if you're a pluralist 2 and you clearly think pluralism 2 is true, so that is, then you got a question of like, well, where are you starting from? But that's fine. The monist cannot demand the pluralist 2 rule out monism in the fundamental language by using the generic unrestricted quantifier that the pluralist 2 doesn't believe is part of the fundamental language. Sure. I mean, that'd be begging the question. That is to beg the question as pluralist 2. So it meets condition 1. So pluralism 2 star gives pluralist-friendly truth conditions for pluralism 2 that contain non-fundamental expressions. In particular, pluralism 2 star doesn't use a generic unrestricted quantifier. The pluralist 2 believes that everything exists 1 or exists 2. So in pluralism 2 star, by using for all 1 and for all 2, she is quantifying over everything, even though she's not saying that she is quantifying over everything. So the task is done. Yeah, this is descriptive, not prescriptive, as I mentioned earlier. Why does Biles claim that Marx has shown that the pluralist 2 cannot do this? Marx does consider pluralism 2, but he does not say that it fails to state truth conditions for pluralism 2. Rather, he says it will not work as a statement of pluralism 2. He says this because it is consistent with the varieties of pluralism that accept more than 2 ways of being. So he says it will not work as a statement of pluralism that accepts only 2 ways of being. Yes, only 2 ways of being, maybe, is the issue here. But to respond to Biles' dilemma, we do not need to state pluralism 2 in a way that monist and pluralist n for n not equal to cannot accept. Yeah, that's right. We have already stated it with pluralism 2. To respond to Biles' dilemma, we must give a metaphysical semantics for pluralism 2. We must give a pluralist-friendly truth conditions for pluralism 2 that contain no non-fundamental expressions. Pluralism 2 star does that. To demand that we offer a metaphysical semantics for pluralism 2 that monists and pluralists for n not 2 cannot accept is to demand that pluralist 2 rule out monism and pluralism n for n not equal to in the fundamental language, but that demand is unreasonable. I mean, there may be, who knows how many things there exist in this world, but I mean, if you're just making a claim for one of them, you do not have to go through and rule out all the other options, usually. As McDaniel 2018 puts it, in the fundamental language, we have to be able to show that monism and pluralism n are false, even though in the fundamental language we can't say that they are false. Yeah, you can argue against them, but like proving something is much, much more difficult, especially something like, you're going to prove monism is false? Like, really? It's been around for thousands of years in the West. I don't know how far in like East. Yeah, so probably longer. So, the statement of pluralism 2 should rule out monism and pluralism n, but that statement doesn't have to be a fundamental truth, only truth conditions for pluralism 2, of course, because you're going to end up begging the question at this point on no matter what. If you're like absolutely trying to rule them out, you're going to beg the question on one side, because usually there's a consistent way of, or at least what appears to be consistent way of making your own case by your own lights. Compare the following example. Someone believes that only mereological symbols exist, and she believes that the predicate is part of does not show up in the fundamental language. She would state her view as everything lacks proper parts, but she would not think that that is a fundamental truth if she accepts purity, since it contains a non-fundamental expression. So it must have a metaphysical semantics, but the truth conditions for everything lacks proper parts can't talk about proper parthood, and so can't say that nothing has proper parts. But that doesn't show that it can't be true, or that it can't be stated, or that it doesn't have a metaphysical semantics. It just can't be stated in the fundamental language. But the fundamental language shouldn't have to talk about the non-fundamental stuff. Indeed, it cannot. Yeah. The situation is similar with pluralism. Pluralism 2 talks about everything, but doesn't say that it's talking about everything. And it shouldn't have to, since WP4 pluralist doesn't think that the generic quantifier, the quantifier that can quantify over everything, is fundamental. So you've got this fundamental theory that doesn't actually talk about everything, but Why should a fundamental theory have to talk about everything? Well, I don't know. Well, just because we don't know how to talk about it doesn't mean... No, we figure stuff out later. Just it doesn't prove that it doesn't exist. I mean, just because we don't know how to talk about it now doesn't mean we won't be able to talk about it in the future at some point. I mean, and there's, as I mentioned earlier, but I think before you got here, that there's a bunch of like, and in the footnotes, there are some really weird theories about what does and doesn't exist, and so this only applies to sort of a standard view. This argument. I mean, granted, the standard view covers most things in most positions. It's just it's sort of like a liar paradox here. You can say that you're lying, but then but you can't like say that you're saying that you're lying, because then you get yourself. You can sort of say it, but then you can't really mean it. So it's like this can talk about everything, but it doesn't say that it talks about everything. All right, whatever. I'll have to think about this a bit more. I'm not entirely certain on this like italicized say. It's like it sort of leaves the door open that there's lots of things in the world, and the pluralist is just saying, this is the way to talk about everything, but they can't they can't put their foot down and say this is the right way, because that would actually be quantifying over everything. So if you are putting your foot down saying, well, these are the two different ways things to be, then you have to assume that if you knew that those were the only ways to be, then you could, in some sense, view both of them together in one way, and then that you'd know those were the limit of ways things to be, and then that would be somehow a more fundamental claim. Okay. No, it's not a existence proof. It's yeah, I think I'm trying to explain better now. The paragraph it's just it's a limitation on what the person who holds this position can claim. They can say this is the right way to go about things, that they can say pluralism too is the right thing, but they can't like insist that pluralism too is properly talking about everything. It doesn't say that it is. It's just saying it's like making like saying I'm right, but it's not actually saying anything about the world in some sense. So it's like just saying, well, my position is correct. And you're saying, well, that means you're saying something about the world. You're saying, no, I'm just saying I'm right. That's kind of what's going on here. Here's a similar example. Suppose that someone believes that only mereological simples are quantified over by the fundamental quantifier. She also thinks since there are tables is true in English, so she gives a metaphysical semantics for it. There are tables is true in English if and only if some simples and stand in relation R1, R2, R3, blank, blank, dot, dot, dot. The table believer could insist that doesn't guarantee that there are tables, since it doesn't say there are tables. But that is to beg the question against this kind of mereological nihilist. You see, this is what's going on here. You can say that, like, I'm right, this is what a table is, but you can't say that there are tables. To conclude, I conclude the pluralist can solve Bowles' dilemma. Pluralism 2 is true, but not fundamental. Pluralism 2 stars a statement of truth conditions for pluralism 2 in the fundamental language. It doesn't work as a statement of pluralism 2, but in fundamental language one needn't be able to state pluralism 2. Conclusion: there are many ways of being an ontological pluralist. I would hope so. I mean, it seems almost like a joke statement, but it's not. One way of being an ontological pluralist is to accept a generic unrestricted quantifier and a notion of naturalness or fundamentality, and say that the generic unrestricted quantifier is less natural or fundamental than the quantifiers for the many ways of being. Those who do are able to solve both Merrick and Bowles' dilemmas. Okay. The issue with this paper is, yeah, you're getting this double speak here at the end, which may be okay. The double speak. You're adopting an unrestricted quantifier and a notion of naturalness and fundamentality, which are tied together. So you have to sort of like rank, you have to have a hierarchy of quantifiers based on some one of these notions, whatever that may be. And so, yeah, so, I mean, if you are interested in this stuff, I think it's a nice paper. You have to sort of bite the bullet and pick one of the, some sort of way of ordering the world to, organize what you count as what things are plural on the same level and then what are less fundamental, because you think if there's, as long as not everything isn't a unique fundamental thing in itself, then you have to have some way of organizing that. And it's interesting that this argument doesn't prove, but it shows or argues for the fact that you can sort of you can state your position in a way that it makes sense. You can say this is the right one, but then you can't at the same time say that is the way the world is. So that's interesting. Okay, that's it for this paper. I might be back in a few minutes. Actually, no, this is gonna be it for this morning. I think I'll be back tonight. If you have any suggestions about what to read, if I should read next, let me know in the chat or send me a message. I'll post this to YouTube, and that's it for now. Have a good day. Thanks for watching.